As we move closer to the American presidential election, we all know how divisive politics can be. But is there a way to step back and engage in politics more Christianly? In this Q&A episode, we bring you to a live event from Washington, D.C. last spring. At that event, Russell Moore is joined by David French and Curtis Chang for the After Party Live, an event that convened pastors and church leaders not around partisanship or issues, but around how Christians can act with integrity, fortitude, and gospel hope when political temperatures run hot. In this episode, the first half is a moderated conversation that I, Ashley Hales, led with Russell, David, and Curtis about the telos of our politics. Where are we headed? How might we understand our politics in light of the good news of the gospel and the biblical story? And how might we take a posture of hope as we look ahead? The second half of the conversation, we get real practical, where we have taken questions from our audience to engage with on-the-ground examples with Russell, Curtis, and David French. We hope you'll listen into these conversations with a friend who may sit across the political aisle from you, and that you'll be able to find a way forward. Listen in. So in the biblical arc of Scripture, many of you will know this, right? We start with creation, that God created the world good. We move on, of course, in Genesis chapter 3, that sin and brokenness and fallenness enters the world. And then the long story of God's redemption, where he is continuing to run after his people. We see that, of course, culminating in our Savior, Jesus Christ. And now, after his life, death, resurrection, and ascension, we live in this in-between, the already and not yet space. And that we believe that all of human history is headed towards a party where we will be united with Jesus, and we will gather around a table from every tribe, tongue, and nation to glorify Jesus, to be united with him. So the after party points to the true after party. So I would love, Russell, if you'll start us off, to help connect the dots between this true after party and the after party course.
Well, you think about the way that Jesus responded to his disciples when they're arguing about who's the greatest, and then also dealing with James and John's mother about who will sit on the right and the left. Jesus immediately, he does two things. He points to the long-term vision. This is what the kingdom of God in all of its fullness will be. Gives us a little picture of that. And then immediately applies that to how a person is to be living his or her life right now. And so what I often say to people is, it's kind of like if you have a kindergartner and the kindergartner loses the race for class president of the kindergarten. Yeah. It's okay if he cries.
Yeah.
But if you've got a 35-year-old man who is saying, I'll tell you what, back at the Learn and Play kindergarten, they stole that election from me. I should have been the class president. Then you'd be a little worried. And you'd also be worried if what he said was, I was elected president at the Learn and Play kindergarten. You would say, that really should not be that big of a deal to you now, because it was meant to prepare you for something else later on. That's what all of life is, according to the New Testament. It's an internship for the after party that we ultimately are going to have. That means we're learning now something of what it means to be rulers and reigners with Christ in a new creation we can't imagine yet. Yeah. And so it reprioritizes things in our lives. So it's something that ought to free us from idolatries and attachments, but also free us up to then see, well, these things actually do matter because they're shaping and preparing us for something else.
David, would you comment on how that really affects us as we think about living in a pluralistic society?
Yeah, boy, this is a great question, because there's a lot of misconceptions about pluralism. So misconception number one is that pluralism is relativism, that if you're willing to live with people who have different points of view from yourself, that you're somehow not committed to the truth. The reality about pluralism is that in there's two things about it. There's a principled application of pluralism that's rooted in, I think, profound moral truth, which is kind of an extension of the golden rule. I think of it like this: fight for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. I think principles of legal equality, for example, are rooted in biblical justice. Equal protection under the law is rooted in biblical justice. And that's a core foundation of pluralism, for example. There's also kind of a pragmatic element of pluralism that we don't talk about enough. And let me just put it this way. It's kind of pluralism or war. I mean, that's what history teaches us, especially when you have deep religious conflicts and disagreements. And I'm constantly reminded when I think of pluralism of Biola President Barry Corey has this phenomenal description of what pluralism really is and how you live in a pluralistic society. He calls it living with a hard core and a soft edge. In other words, a hard center and a soft edge. So that means your core convictions, they can be deeply rooted, deeply rooted. You don't have to compromise your core convictions, but that soft edge is how you brush up against your neighbors. That's how you interact with your neighbors. Do you interact with an open heart? Do you interact with humility? Do you interact with kindness? And if that's the circumstance, we can sustain life across massive differences. Let's put it this way, when the fruit of the Spirit is present in a relationship, that relationship can sustain major differences. My small group at my church runs the gamut politically, but we have no political conflict because we love each other so much more than we love Donald Trump or Joe Biden. It's just that our core rooted affection is for Jesus, for each other. And so we love each other. We love each other. But not one of us has, everyone who's walked into that small group, we're all in the same political place we were when we started. But we absolutely love each other. And to me, that's a very small version of what pluralism looks like. And people who dislike pluralism keep coming back to the critique of it as somehow it's inherently squishy or it's inherently morally relativistic. That is the opposite of the truth. Pluralism is how people who are not morally relativistic live together in a diverse country. So there is a principle aspect of this. I want you, even when you disagree with me, to enjoy the same rights that I have. And guess what? I think Christians should also go out of their way to defend the rights of other people. We should be known for that. If you see somebody you disagree with who's being treated very unfairly and unjustly, get in that foxhole with them. Do it. It's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful for human relationships. So there's that principle, but then there's just the pragmatism. Everyone who is saying, we will win and dominate and vanquish our enemies. When we talk about pluralism, I think of that as something that is a value to defend properly understood, but there's an enormous educational effort that's necessary to show people that it does not mean being squish at all. It does not mean abandoning your core convictions. It's how we sustain them in this society.
That's great. Curtis, of these three personas, you identify as the cynic, right? Which is, I think I technically tested in the cynical quadrant as well, so I feel for you. But for those of us maybe in that quadrant, or those who just find ourselves exhausted and low on hope, how have you found your own call into kind of the public sphere of pluralism that David's just talked about? How has the true after party given you hope to engage and to not be kind of crossing your arms and wondering what's going to happen, or I told you so?
Boy, there's a lot there. I would say one of the ways that has been through friendship, and I narrated the story of how friendship with David led to friendship with Russell, and this project would not be sustained without friendship. So I think for cynics to find friends who can call them out of that posture is very healing. I think the other thing that happened for me was, for a number of years before I sort of stepped into the public square with more energy, I was in my late 40s, early 50s, and I was going through my version of a midlife crisis. And there was a sense of I guess the best way I could put it was, I felt like my prayers sounded a little bit like a a football player on the sideline saying to the coach, please put me in the game. I just felt like I was not exercising my full gifts fully. I was busy, I was active, I was productive, but I had an internal nagging sense that I was not laying it all out on the line, and I was protecting myself. And that's really what a cynic is doing, it is a fundamentally self-protective posture. And the problem when you self-protect is you also put yourself on the sideline. That's, in a football game, that is the best way to protect yourself, is to stay on the sidelines. And so I think something in me realized that if I really wanted to feel fully alive, fully activated, to really put yourself, and I think that's a fundamentally human, God-implanted impulse in us, that all of us, at whatever age we are in, have something of that sense of like, I want to lay it out on the line. And so tapping into that in prayer, in contemplation, I felt like it was the coach was saying, okay, well then that means getting out on the field and potentially getting hit, not potentially getting hit.
Yeah.
So that was a big driver for me.
You know, it strikes me, as much as we are propelled by hope, right? We live in of course, Christ has already bought our salvation, but it's not yet fully realized. And so there is a cost to this hopeful posture, right, that you all three are modeling for us. And we'll start with you, David. Maybe if you have a story or an anecdote, if you'd like to share about how you have borne the cost of unearned suffering and what has been a stabilizing force for you through that.
A lot of people would say I've earned that suffering, that I deserve it richly.
You owe some back.
Yeah, but that issue about unearned suffering, and I don't want to go back through my family's story over these last 8 years, because some of you have already heard it, but it's been hellish is the right word. The combination of racist attacks on our daughter, threats against my wife, threats against me, harassment at our home, all of that stuff has been really hellish in many ways. And I will be completely honest with you and transparent with you guys. When I figure out how to deal with it, I will tell you. I'll be honest. Because here's this thing. A lot of times we look at people who've been through stuff like that, and we actually, in a weird way, see them as having shrugged it off or have gone through it in a way that seems unnatural. And that's part of the projection that you make, because you don't want anyone to think that they've gotten to me or that they can hurt me, right? You want to project like you've got armor plating. And I finally just come to the realization that that's just not honest. It's just not honest. And the thing that it does is, if I'm just a normal person, and I was not created to be hated. That was not why I was created. I was not created to be hated. So it wounds your spirit, it hurts your soul. And then if you act like it doesn't, then for all the folks out there, when you get hit and when you get hurt, sometimes you feel inadequate, that it hurts you. Sometimes you feel like, what's wrong with me that I'm hurt by this? And I don't want you to feel like that when you are walking this walk, because there will be difficult moments. And it's not on you to just shrug it off. It's not on you to shrug it off. You can weep. You can lament. We saw Jesus talking about unearned suffering before he's about to face it. Yeah. He was in a state of lament about what he was about to face. And this was the person who was going to defeat death and hell, right? And so I think it's really important to understand that we need to persevere, but we also need to recognize our own limitations. Yeah. And surround ourselves with people who love us, surround ourselves with people who encourage us, who know us truly. And then the last thing I'll say about this sort of view of having a very, very thick skin, that is bad for you. That's very bad for you as a person, because guess what? I'm very flawed, and I need criticism. I need it. So if I build a thick skin and armor plate, I'm going to become a jerk really fast, right? Because I'm going to think I'm always right. I'm going to think my critics are always wrong. So how do you live through that? And I think of it as having kind of a leather skin. I think of it as trying to build at least a thick enough skin to where you're not in the fetal position all the time, but maintain a soft enough heart when you can hear legitimate criticism.
Yeah.
And so that's the balance that I try to strike. And I don't always strike it properly, and I don't always strike it well. In fact, I had an interaction with a gentleman about 2 weeks ago where he was kind of aggressive in confronting me after an event, and I don't think I handled it very well, and it's bothered me for days. And so I think that just understand you're human, it will hurt. There's no magic formula, but we have to be strong enough to persevere through the criticism, but soft-hearted enough to hear it when it's legitimate.
That's great. Go ahead.
Okay, so I used to be the senior pastor of a evangelical church in California. So you can caricature California evangelicalism as overly therapeutic, such that everything that you experience can be traceable to a mother wound or a father wound that you're working out. But in its defense, sometimes that is actually a helpful lens on one's emotional reactions to things. We're going to go have a little therapy session here for me, just for a moment, just so that you understand how this is, because this is the genuine answer to the question. I grew up I'm an immigrant myself. My dad is old school Chinese, and it was very difficult to be of his generation because he's used to being treated with just utmost deference and respect, and he's growing up in an American culture that doesn't do that, and with a teenage son that is caught in between cultures and is, giving him adolescent eye rolls, because that's what I saw in school. And he had a very hard time with that. And he responded as this was an affront on him. And so the way he responded would be to mischaracterize my intentions on things. He would say, "Oh, you think you're so smart, Curtis. You think you can laugh at your father. You think that you know everything," right? So just even a small thing that I might disagree with got turned into an attack, a critique on my character. And that was deeply wounding for me, and has, quite honestly, shaped my character, including my character flaws, which is when I feel like someone is falsely impugning my motives or my character in doing something, it triggers all of that, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old self in me that feels deeply wounded, and I react very poorly to that. You can ask my wife. This comes out in our marriage. So I would say that has been the hardest thing about doing this work in the public sphere, is when I get attacks about my motivation in doing something that I feel are just unfair, are mischaracterizing. I go to an aggressive defense, shall we? So, and I over defend myself. I over critique the other side. Russell and I were just in an event yesterday where I just did that, and that's that. I know where that's coming from. I know where that's coming from. It's coming from that 10 or 11-year-old self that feels that I've been mischaracterized. And the reason I share that with all of you is because as you all go into your little spheres, which may not be the public sphere, but it is in the family dinner. It is the conversation with your parents or your children or your, it will trigger painful things, because you're out on the field now. You're gonna get hit, and that's gonna hurt. And when we get hurt, it triggers all of our very deep, primal childhood selves of how we tend to respond to hurt. And it can be helpful to be aware of that and realize that even in that is a moment of opportunity for redemption and for healing, that we can actually invite Jesus into even those places and say that even in this political conflict and hurt, there actually is some deep growth and deep healing of some deep wounds in us that is possible.
Some of you have given us some of your questions. The very first one is someone would like to see what would be an example of how to engage well on a hot button topic with a family member or close friend who has significantly different views. What does this actually look like in practice?
Well, I'll give you one example of something that happened in my life. I have somebody that I love and respect, but who very deeply disagrees with me, and actually wrote a letter out very strongly about a political sort of issue. And I said, you know what? This is not the kind of relationship I want us to have. I really need you in my life. I have all kinds of people I can argue politics with. Can we agree that we're not going to have that? And what that means is I'm not going to read that letter, because I don't want every interaction with you to be rehearsing whatever was said in that letter, and I don't want you to be rehearsing whatever my response is to that letter. So can we just agree to have this space? And that person did agree to that. And I found, the scripture says, so far as is possible with you, live at peace with all people. It's not always possible with you. But one of the things that we think sometimes is that if we are not arguing our viewpoint in every context, then that means that we're somehow giving it up. What you have to think through is to say, what is my responsibility in this context and in this moment? So if you're on the school board, you can't say, I don't want to argue education policy. Your responsibility is to do that. But when it comes to, say, a mom or a dad or a son or a daughter or a friend, often if you say, hey, I'm not going to change you, you're not going to change me, but I actually value you, can we just agree to a kind of a demilitarized zone right now? That does not imply that you don't care very strongly about what you think, or that person doesn't care very strongly about what he or she thinks. It means that you're saying, in this space, we're going to try to protect this relationship. And what I found in giving people the counsel to do that is that sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes there's someone who says, I'm not going to do that. But often it does. It's not a one-time fix, which is why if you add a little bit of humor to it, where when one of you starts to kind of circle around whatever the sensitive issue or personality or whatever is, you can say, oh, wait, I think we're coming into this danger zone here. Yeah. We're going to back up. Most people are really willing to do that. And you're able then to maintain some kind of a connection through that. And that's what's important right now, where everything becomes about politics and culture wars.
I was deeply influenced years ago when I read of Jonathan Haidt's analogy of the elephant and the rider. That, and if you're not familiar with this, think about a human being as an elephant and a rider. The rider is your rational self. It's the part that says 2 + 2 = 4, 3 + 3 = 6. The Southeastern Conference is the best football conference in America. Like, all of the indisputed facts. And then the elephant, but that's your rational mind. The elephant is everything else. So your upbringing, your ethnicity, your mood that day, how you feel, your everything else, your friendships, your relationships, your disposition, your temperament. And the way Jonathan Haidt says it is, everyone wants to talk to the rider, like to have this hyper-rational conversation. We fool ourselves into thinking we're just these hyper-rational people. And as Jonathan Haidt says, if you can talk to the rider all day, but if the elephant doesn't want to move, the rider isn't going anywhere. But if you reach the elephant, the rider's coming along. Now, ideally, you want to reach rider and elephant, so there's unity of mind and emotions and heart. And so that really impacted me. And so one of the things that I really try to do is talk to the elephant. And how do you talk to the elephant? Well, there's a couple of ways. Begin with affection. Begin with affection. Have a default posture of affection towards other people. Not smarminess and fake smiliness or whatever, but genuine concern, genuine affection. And then move to connection. What is the common element? What are the things that what is it about, you and that other person where you can find some common ground? And then once that affection and connection is established, and a lot of times you've kind of got the elephant stamping its feet a little bit, like it's feeling comfortable. And then you move to the reason element. Because I think if you only talk to the elephant, that can be manipulation, right? Yeah. If you only talk to the rider, well, then you're just ineffective. Right. If you unify elephant and rider, but it has to be done in a genuine spirit of affection.
That's great.
And, I'm not naive. I know there are unpersuadable people. I know there are people who are just cruel. But I try to begin with a rebuttable presumption of affection, a rebuttable presumption that we can connect. And time and time and time again, in applying that, I've been able to get past the anger and just have a real talk and emerge from it, often with a friend, even if we don't agree with each other at the end of it.
Yeah, that's great. Curtis, I'd love to just ask you about the stakes of the what versus the how. So one of us wrote in and asked about, aren't the stakes about the what actually really high when it comes to certain communities and issues? And in such a context, couldn't the how potentially be a way of avoiding action or conflict?
Yes, I don't know how many times we have to say this, but we will underline it. We are not saying the what does not matter. We are not saying that you should not care about the what. And I think especially for some especially vulnerable communities, communities of color or other communities in lower, economically vulnerable, disadvantaged communities, there are real issues at stake that matter, and the what does matter. Now, even there's going to be a lot of difference, even within those communities. There will be a lot of difference of what's the straight line there, and they'll recognize there's multiple ways of, even when you're clear on a policy objective, of how you actually accomplish that. So even in the what, you're always going to have to figure out a way to deal with difference and deal with people who think differently than you. So we just need to underline that even more. At the same time, you can say that is true, and also that even if you are absolutely clear and right on the what, but you've got the how wrong in an unfaithful way that is counter to the gospel, you've lost the game. You've lost the game. A what achieved by unholy hows is never justified. Jesus' death on the cross is a perfect example of that, right? So as Christians, we of all people should reject a utilitarian calculation that says some whats are so important that we can disobey Jesus on the how.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
David, there are some criticisms of the after party online that say this initiative is funded by the quote unquote far left. How would those of us here who have enjoyed today respond to people who are skeptical of the after party for this reason?
Yeah, this is actually a good story.
Yeah.
So shortly after 2016, early into 2017, a lot of people on both sides of the ideological spectrum began to realize that our country is heading towards a potential catastrophe, that animosity had grown to such an extent, mutual animosity had grown to such an extent that when I was talking to some thought leaders on the left and the right, they were saying, I don't know that we can stay together as a country over the long term. And what's interesting is some of these thought leaders on both the left and the right said, and I've been part of the problem. And so you have had people with growing awareness on left and right that this division in our country is so toxic and that the anger and the hatred are so palpable that we have to do something about it. So a number of groups were formed that unified left and right. And one of the interesting things about this is we had to agree to not play the guilt by association game. Because we're never going to come together and we're never going to get past this crisis if we say we're only going to be in fellowship or only going to receive support from the people who already agree with us. Then it's all back to the same thing. And so there are a number of groups formed. One of them was called New Pluralists, which was an interesting group. It includes groups on the right like Stand Together. It includes like the Walmart Foundation. My first employer, by the way, Walmart. I sold guns at a Walmart in Georgetown, Kentucky, the most hashtag America job you can have. and so it includes institutions on the left, it includes institutions on the right, but they're united in the idea that we cannot get through this moment without decency towards each other, without civility towards each other, without tolerance properly understood towards each other. And so when Curtis and I were imagining the after party, one of the things about this is we've talked about this how issue is that there is a unified sense on left and right, both religious left, religious right, secular left, secular right, that the how really matters. And so we went to some of those people who have expressed, both left and right, this concern about the how. Now, what's super critical about this is we did not solicit nor receive input on the content of the course. We went to them with the course outlined. This is what we intend to do. And you can join with us or not join with us. And I think it's actually a quite good story that if you look at the combination of the funders and the sponsors of all of this, it really does truly span the spectrum in so many ways. And you look at the sponsors today for this event, this really is an effort from people across the political spectrum who really are concerned with the how and believe that unless we get the how correct, that we can't have a country, that we can't have, and many times, friendships, relationships. And so to me, the funding here is a good story. It's a story about actually, in many ways, putting into practice the principles of the after party, which is we're not looking to score partisan points. That is not the purpose. Now, as Curtis said, we are not neglecting the what at all. In fact, the reason why we chose the civil rights movement as sort of the model is because who's going to say that Martin Luther King Jr. neglected the what? And the stakes for him and for the civil rights movement were higher than the stakes that we have right now in so many tangible ways. And yet they never lost sight of the how. If you look at for example, the commitment cards for the philosophy of nonviolence. I would encourage you to Google that and to look at some of the commitments that if you are going to be marching in Birmingham or in Selma, these are the commitments you are making in the face of incredible evil, quite frankly. And so what we were talking about when we were talking about funding this is actually, or when we were funding this, we were actually reaching out to people who in many ways had come to us as in many ways recognizing prior to creating New Pluralists that all of these different groups may have been part of the problem. And then suddenly, and they wanted to be part of the solution. And so I think that it's actually a quite good story. And I'm actually proud of the story, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you.
By the way, this was the question that yesterday triggered the 11-year-old Curtis Chang. So it's a good thing that David is answering this question now. So.
Well, we've had on the show, Russell, we've had Jonathan Haidt, who has spoken about youth anxiety, and his new book, The Anxious Generation, is fantastic. And we have a question here about, do you think that the increasing youth anxiety is a reflection of the increasing anxiety in the political sphere? And if not, how do you foresee these new generations growing up and affecting the politics of tomorrow?
I'm not sure that the youth anxiety is coming from the anxiety in the political sphere, but I'm pretty sure they're both coming from the same place. And so there is a sense of siege and a sense of our looking to find all of these little judgment seats to be able to stand in front of. So if you think about one of the huge problems with adolescence in terms of smartphones, and John Haidt talks about this in his new book, The Anxious Generation, is that there's a sense of every adolescent is always sort of fearful about what do people think of me. I'm not really sure. When we sit, I have 5 sons, every time right before middle school, I'll sit them down and say, hey, there are some people who are nostalgic for college. There are some people who want to relive high school all the time. There is nobody nostalgic for middle school. Middle school is rough for everybody. You don't know really who you are yet. You're looking around, who are my people? What did they think of me? With smartphone technology, it's almost like you've got polling data for a politician, except without an election at the end of it. It just goes on and on and on. The same thing is happening with adults. So you have this sense of, I think one of the things that we don't pay enough attention to when it comes to tribalism is how rooted it is in fear. because there is and psychologists will show you, the sense of being outside of one's tribe, of what the place of people where one feels safe, is equivalent to physical pain. And so people don't want to go through that. And so I think that both of those things are coming from the same place. And then you add to that the second thing that I think is going on in both places, and that's boredom. There is when I was a teenager, one of the ways that you could really get a crowd into a church or into a revival meeting is to say, we're going to be talking about Bible prophecy and applying it to what's happening right now. So you can come in, you could draw a huge crowd because people really wanted to feel like we're the terminal generation. This is the end of everything, and I have a front row seat, and I'm a key player in all of that. The same thing is happening now, except it's secularized. So there is this key pivotal moment. There are all of these shadowy forces who are conspiring against you, and you get to be the one who's the hero leading through this. And so that kind of gives you this adrenal kind of rush. But it doesn't last. And what comes after that then is anxiety. And the problem is what we do is kind of like somebody who has a problem with substances, who says, okay, well now I'm more anxious than I was before. That means I need more of that substance. It just compounds the problem.
David, we get a question about a lot of the work of the after party, right? We're talking about our local context. We're talking about small groups. We're talking about friendship. And we have a question about, are there systemic reforms or policy changes that could create a healthier political incentive structure alongside this important work at the individual level?
That's a great question. And I'm literally like teaching a five-part course on that for lifelong learners in Nashville, Tennessee, talking about sort of the principles of the American founding and the threats there too. One of the big issues that we have right now, and I'm going to get wonky and not spiritual, for a minute, because I'm really kind of wonky in part of my life. Okay, a big issue with one of the core concepts around the founding of our country was to separate from one sovereign these functions that you had in one sovereign in Britain of warrior, king, judge, priest, like the King of England was the head of the Church of England. And when you have everything in one sovereign, then what ends up happening is all the time the warrior prevails. So if it's warrior, priest, king, judge, and you don't like the judging, you get the warrior. If you don't like the kinging, you get the warrior. If you don't like the priesting, you get the warrior. And so it becomes inherently oppressive over time. And so one of the problems we have in this country is the magnification of power in the hands of one individual, for example, is recreating the very dynamic and the very concept that means that it's not the same thing to say that every presidential election is the most important in our lifetime, but you can say that in almost every election of my lifetime, we've elected the most powerful president because of the accretion and the accumulation of power in one person. And so that creates, people feel as if there's extremely high stakes, high and high and higher. And then at the same time, the very part of our country that was supposed to be most democratically participatory, which is the House of Representatives and Congress. A trigger phrase for me is co-equal branches of government. A trigger for you is like your 11-year-old self. Trigger for me is if somebody says co-equal branches, it's go time. But the most democratic element of American government, the Congress, was supposed to be more powerful than the other two branches. The other two can check it, but look, Congress can fire you if you're a president. Congress can fire you for Supreme Court justice. And so what's happened is that most participatory part of American government has become less important. And then the least participatory parts have become more important, both the president and the judiciary. So we're turning the whole thing upside down, in which, by the way, also creates problems with the very pluralistic framework of our country, because where will pluralism manifest itself most clearly? In these elective representative bodies. And so we're moving away from the body that is most pluralistic, heading towards the body that is most singularly sovereign, which escalates the stakes. At the same time, you feel like you have a less of a voice. And then see me afterwards for all of the constitutional and statutory adjustments that can fix that. But this gets to, I don't want to get too much into all of the what, but there is a reason why people feel more helpless. There is a reason why people feel that every 4 years is doing more than it used to do. Mm-hmm. And so it's very important, even as we're talking about sort of the how, is to acknowledge the validity of that increasing sort of feeling of helplessness, this sort of increasing feeling that you're less of a citizen and more of a subject, if that makes sense. And so that's key to the entire pluralistic enterprise. And now we can go back to theology.
Well, thank you.
Now back to your regular program.
Back to regular scheduled program.
Well, Russell, I wonder if you would conclude us with this question that someone says, it seems to me that the after party is a first step that many churches need, but it isn't the whole journey. They ask for if there's complementary resources or other themes or challenges that you would want to bring up to help us kind of create this broader vision for political discipleship. But I'd also love to see if you would just give us a word of encouragement towards our future hope in this moment in time.
Well, one of the things that I learned early on working in areas of orphan care, adoption, foster care, and those kinds of things is that I would often have people who would come up to me and say, our church just doesn't get it. Our church just isn't, our pastor doesn't care about this. And I would say, I'll bet that what's happening is you're going up to your pastor and saying, what are you going to do about the foster care system around us? And your pastor has 1,001 things going on. Try this. Instead, why don't you come up and say, can a small group of us here start experimenting on ways that we can address the foster care situation in our community? Will you bless that? What happens is you have people who go in, they try things, they don't work, they try other things, they don't work, and then they find an area that's actually working and serving, and that lights up the imagination of other people who will say, I might not could do that, but I can do this. One of the most powerful moments I've ever had in a church service, it wasn't my own, was going into a church somewhere in Florida where there was a man who stood up behind the podium, obviously seemed nervous, didn't like to be up there. And he said, I'm a mechanic. God's gifted me to be able to fix cars. And I know that we have a lot of single moms in our community that can't afford to have their cars worked on to get back and forth to work. What I'll do is the first Saturday of every month, I'll help you with basic auto maintenance. Now, the reason that was so powerful is not just because it was employing his gifts for the single moms in the community. It's because you had other people throughout that congregation who were saying, wait, I'm not gifted in that way, but here's what I could do. And that just catalyzes all kinds of ministry. A lot of what happens, the way we're going to get through this time, is not so much with a do this, do this, do this, do this. And that's what often happens is people will say, well, give us some hope. And what they mean by that is tell us that this is all just going to go away and be okay. And what I have to say is, well, if you mean here's the 7-point plan to get to where we want to be, we don't have that, and we rarely do as the people of God. But what I can say is there's a way of being. There's a way of saying, I'm not going to conform to the pattern of this world, but I am going to have the renewing of my mind. And you will be shocked at how many people are actually watching and overhearing. I mean, I think of the people who have had the most influence on all of my life are people who had no idea they had any influence on my life. I never told them that. I just was looking at this person and saying, that is the way to be a godly leader in a congregation. That is the way to love someone's family. You can do that in your local congregation, and you'll be surprised at how those things come together. And what I would say, too, with that, remember what Jesus said. We're always looking for signs. I will give no sign to you, he says, but the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And as Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah, so will the sign of Jonah be. I think we often are looking for signs and roadmaps when instead what we ought to be paying attention to is exactly what Jesus told us. We're walking forward by faith, looking for a city we can't see except from afar. And when you turn around and you notice the way that the gospel is still going forward, people still have their lives transformed. I was really chastened at probably my most cynical moment. It was a week where I thought, I just don't think American Christianity is going to make it. And that day happened to be when I was baptizing my son, Jonah, in our congregation. And as I was saying his name, I baptize you, Jonah, that passage hit me. And I said, what an act of ingratitude that I have been focusing on all the things that are missing and all the things that are lost when I'm looking down into the face of my beloved child who is following after the way of Jesus from the witness that he's received from us and that we receive from others and they receive from still others all the way back to Jesus himself. Why should I not step back and say, that's grace, and it's amazing? We need to pay attention to that. That's actually what we need to give us hope for the future.
Amen. Well, will you please thank our 3 teachers with me? Thank you. That was wonderful. If you enjoy The Russell Moore Show, take a second to share this episode with a friend or leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Host is Russell Moore. Produced by Ashley Hales. Associate producers are Abby Perry and Mackenzie Hill. Director of Operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens. Audio engineering provided by Dan Phelps. Video producer is Abby Egan. And the theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.